So last week we looked at part 1, and we'll look at part 2 today. Part 2 is the section that runs from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to chapter 5, verse 1. And what makes me divide it the way that I do is those little markers in the text. There's a Hebrew word toledot. This is the toledot of the heavens and the earth. Occurs in chapter 2, verse 4. And then you don't get that again until chapter 5, verse 1. This is the toledot of the origins of mankind. Question is, how do you translate toledot? What exactly does that mean? Or I think it might even say this is the book of the toledot of the origins of mankind. And I would argue that basically toledot means the beginnings, the origins of something. So the first account is the origins of the heavens and the earth. And the second account is the origins of mankind, the book of the origins of mankind. Hopefully you all have a copy. This is my translation and my reformatting of the text. We won't go through all of it tonight. The next time we'll finish it. We'll get about halfway through tonight. But if you were to look at the subheadings here, you'll notice that it's divided into basically 4 sections. The first one I called the creation of the prototypical man, woman, and marriage. That's the first section. The second section I entitled the unmasking of human sinfulness. That's typically understood as the account of, traditionally it's called the account of the fall, but I'm going to argue that there is no such thing as a fall. It's the account of the temptation, the test in the garden. But the whole point of it, I think, in the context of this account, is from the very beginning, from the very get-go, the Bible is going to tell us that mankind, at their very roots, are evil, rebellious, disobedient, depraved creature. And that's our problem. And even most importantly, from the get-go, mankind is under the condemnation of death. So that the entire account, that's what unifies the entire account, is we don't not only have the creation of male and female. We pass these around to. We not only have the creation of the human male and the human female, but we have these accounts that drive home the point that they are evil and sinful. Then the third section, which we won't get to tonight, but we have the very early dramatic manifestations of sin. So if the account of the test of mankind, whether man was good or evil, is not good enough, right off the bat, the next generation, we have a murder occurring. And so there's the account of the murder of Abel by Cain and Cain's response to that. And then the fourth section is genealogy, a little bit of genealogy, a little bit of the history of who are the people that then descended from Cain and Abel. But what we notice is a divide in mankind right from the get-go. There's a righteous line and an unrighteous line. And then that becomes very important when we get to the next account in Genesis, which is the account of Noah and the flood. Okay, so it divides into 4 sections. What's the genre of this section? There are all kinds of reasons why it's attractive to think of the creation of Adam and Eve and the fall as some kind of mythology. And the reason it's attractive is because so much of what you read there about what the dynamics of the relationship, the inner dynamics of the temptation, everything in there we can relate to. It is so familiar. It sounds so realistically a description of universal human nature. So it's very easy to just kind of jump to the conclusion. So it must just be a story that is intended to represent to us universal human traits and phenomena and dynamics and relationships and that kind of thing. So I've always been kind of attracted to that, not having studied it, not knowing really what to do with it. That's always seemed like an option to me. But as I looked at it more carefully, studying it this time, this is just flat out straight history. These are actual events of actual particular concrete individual human beings, how they came into being, what the nature of their relationship was and the dynamics of their relationship, and what occurred in the very earliest origins of mankind. So I'm quite confident at this point that the right way to read this entire account, not some of the sections, but the entire account, is to see it as really straightforward historical occurrences and historical events. Unlike the first account. See, that's not the position I took last week. In that I think is highly artificial, not intended in any way at all to actually describe events the way they actually occurred. That's a contrived artificial structure. And it's important to see that in order to understand what the point of it is and what's going on there. But when we get to part two, this account, entirely different genre. And I think we're dealing with actual history here. So what that means is the source of it has to be some eyewitness. At least the source for some of the material can be none other than Adam himself. It has to be Adam. Not that he wrote the account, but he has to be the eyewitness source of some of the material. We don't really have any way of knowing ultimately who wrote it, but it's not likely to be, it's not Moses. It's going to have to be someone near enough to the events to be able to have Adam as a source and so on. So Moses then, if Moses is indeed the one who put together the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, then this is a document, a standalone document that he incorporated into this work that we call Genesis. And I think that's why you have him saying in 2:4, this is the Toledot of the heavens and the earth, and this is the Sefer, the book of the Toledot of mankind. Why? He's telling us what his source is. So he has either reproduced verbatim an earlier source, an earlier account, or he's telling us that he's reformatted and given us a fresh rendition of an earlier account, and he's telling us what the account was that he's reproducing. Questions on any of that? I want to just go through the first half of this paragraph by paragraph, but that's it.
What's your sense of it being a written account as opposed to an oral history that's passed down?
It could be an account that's been passed down orally. It is interesting that he uses the word that's typically used for a written account in describing the second one. So the question is it only a written account because he's written it down and that's what he's referring to, or is he referring to a previously? And I don't know how you would know that. So yeah, it could be an oral tradition. Mm-hmm. Particularly because in oral cultures, I mean, a verbatim memorization of a story is not at all unusual. So. Mm-hmm.
So, can you draw any conclusions? It's on. Can we presuppose any familiarity with this tradition, whether oral or written, on the part of the Israelites to whom the Pentateuch has been delivered?
Yes.
So this is not the first time they've heard this story.
Right. I mentioned for example, with respect to the first account, completely out of the blue, when the manna is being given by God to the Israelites after the Exodus in the wilderness, and part of the instruction is, but you don't do it on the Sabbath. That's the first we've heard of the Sabbath, apart from the account, Genesis 1. So somebody's familiar, at least Moses is familiar with that account in order to make any sense out of that at all. Is there anything in this account? I can't think of anything right off the top of my head as an example of why they would have been familiar with it. But so I guess I don't know for sure, but it would not surprise me. Paul is certainly familiar with it. I mean, in the past, I've interpreted Genesis 2 in ways that are kind of in tension with how Paul's interpreted, and I just kind of, well, oh well. But now that I see how he's reading the account, yeah, he's right. That's what Genesis says, and he's keenly aware of the account of Adam and Eve, and in particularly details in that account, and of the fall, keenly aware of that. Now, that's not surprising because that's scripture by the time Paul comes along. But whenever it got inscripturated, it becomes a part of their canon of cultural knowledge for sure. Anything else? Okay, let's look at this bit by bit. So the first part is the creation of the prototypical man. In the time when the God Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, even before any plant of the field was on the land, and before any grass of the field had sprung up, for the God had not brought rain upon the land, and there was no human being to cultivate the land, a spring came forth out of the ground and irrigated the whole surface of the ground. Okay, now even here from the get-go, when he says, even before any plant of the field was on the land and before any grass of the field had sprung up, what land is he talking about? He's not talking about the face of the earth, because he's going to tell us in a second there's a garden to the east of him in Eden. So there are plants, they do grow, but they don't grow on this land, on the land that we're talking about here. It's while it was completely and utterly an arid wasteland that this event is going to occur in a place at a time when we're dealing with desert wasteland. So even before any plant of the field was on the land, and before any grass of the field had sprung up, for the God had not brought rain upon the land, and there was no human being to cultivate the land, a spring came forth out of the ground and irrigated the whole surface of the ground. Now, I do think that what he seems to be saying is the only place you had vegetation was along the rivers. There were spring-fed rivers, and we're going to see that there was a spring coming out of the ground that created the headwaters for 4 different and distinct rivers. He's going to describe that in just a second. And it's there that you have the garden that is in the garden that we call the Garden of Eden, the garden that's in the land of Eden. But you get away from the rivers and the land is just arid. It's desert, it's wasteland. That seems to be what he's describing here. A spring came forth out of the ground and irrigated the whole surface of the ground. Then the God Yahweh fashioned a human being out of the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and that human being became a living person. So he scooped up some dust from, I don't know if he actually scooped it up, but he took some dust from this arid desert and fashioned him into a human being, the body of a human being, breathed life into him. Breath and spirit are the same word in Hebrew and in Greek. He breathed the spirit into this human body, and he became a living soul, nephesh. I've translated soul person, because I think that's our word, the word that we would use for soul. A soul is a living, animated expression of a person. Okay. the God Yahweh had planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he placed the human being whom he had fashioned in that place. This is going to be important later. He was created out of the dust of the desert in the west, but after he made him, he took him and placed him in the garden in the land of Eden in the east. Now the God had caused to spring up from the ground every tree that is delightful in appearance and every tree that is good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is significant because the author's putting these two things in opposition to one another. Contrary to traditional readings of Genesis, there are not two trees that are titled and have a name. You don't have a plaque saying the tree of life on this tree and a plaque saying the tree of the knowledge of good and evil on this tree. There's only one plaque. There's only one tree with a name. It's the tree of life, and it's smack dab in the middle. It's always, throughout the whole account, it refers to the tree in the middle of the garden, and it always means the tree of life, which he identifies here as the tree in the middle of the garden. Here, however, he adds the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but I will argue that's not a title for it. The title for it is the tree of life. It's a description of the tree. It's the tree of life that is going to be the test of mankind. What they're forbidden from eating of is the tree of life. And because they're forbidden from eating of it, it's going to be the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because it's going to find out, is you good or is you evil? This tree is going to find them out, because it's the tree that God is using as the test to unmask this human creature and expose the fact that the human being is evil and disobedient, not an obedient creature. I better pause here because I realize this could be really confusing to some of you. I'm going to argue that there is no such thing as a fall. We have this theological doctrine that God created human beings good, and they made a fateful choice that threw them into depravity and sinfulness and disobedience and unrighteousness. And when that happened with them, the entire creation fell. So fell from perfection, fell away from perfection. And that there wouldn't be imperfection, there should be a spare thing floating around. There wouldn't be imperfection if they had chosen differently. If in their freedom they had made a different choice, then the whole cosmos would be a different place. It would be a place of perfection rather than imperfection. And then the whole story is that God sent Jesus into the world to bring redemption. And the redemption that he brings into the world not only restores the possibility of restoration to the perfect state that God had intended from the beginning for mankind, but also for the cosmos, for creation. It's a wonderful story. It's a beautiful story, and it ain't true. That's not what the Bible actually teaches. And we're certainly going to see there's no room in this account for a fall. There just isn't. There's no statement, no explicit statement ever anywhere in the entire account that this is a transition from a perfect state to an imperfect state. You have to read it into the account. You have to impose it on the account. That's the only way you can find it there. It's way more straightforward to realize he made this creature, he forbade him from eating of this tree, and he ate from it. And God said, in the day that you eat from it, you're going to be condemned. And he was. And there you go. And because he was the prototype human being, every human being made in his image is condemned, equally condemned with him. Well, who is the creature that was condemned? The one God created. Who is the creature who is disobedient? The one God created. The entire story of created reality is a story of redemption. It's not fall and redemption. It's not creation, perfect creation, fall and redemption. It's creation of a being in need of redemption, and then the story of redemption following from that. So I'm looking at this through an entirely different paradigm, and I got my paradigm from the text rather than taking it to the text. I couldn't find the fall in this account. So recognize that in everything that I'm saying, this is not the traditional theology, doctrine, and paradigm. Okay, so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, why is it called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Because this is the tree that's going to bring the knowledge to mankind of whether he is good or whether he is evil. This man that God created, this man and woman that God created. Questions on paragraph 1? Paul?
So the tree is essentially a test that will reveal the state that man is in, rather than something that changes the state that man is in.
Exactly.
Is that the way that you're reading it?
Exactly.
I hit the button. I'm so sorry. Is it on? Okay. I snuck in.
Yeah.
So sorry I'm so late.
That's okay.
I thought it was 7:30. So just fill me in. What's the genre here?
History, actual
History.
event.
History,
Concrete,
actual
particular
event.
individuals and what happened to them.
Because and I'm scanning through here. You said this was only paragraph 1, because later on, we're gonna hear about where the gold is good and stuff like that. And it's how is that history? I'm excited to hear about it.
How is that history?
How is that history? Yeah, because I'm guessing you would define history as important events that took place that we should know about.
I don't know about.
Define history then. That's much better.
What
my actual question.
What I mean is that this is a true and accurate description of what actually went down.
Okay.
So.
More than that, not much in terms of.
Well, yeah, I'll comment more on it when we get. I mean, I commented earlier that it's easy to want to take this as a myth, because what actually went down, the dynamics of the relationship between Adam and Eve, the dynamics of the relationship between Eve and Satan, the temptation, the inner thoughts of Eve, all of that we can relate to, I think, universally. So it's easy to think this must be a myth. I mean, this is just representing what every human being is like, what marriage is supposed to be like, what man's supposed to be like. So this is just a made-up story intended to represent to us these truths and these realities and these dynamics. And I've always been tempted to take it that way, but not having studied it, not committing myself to anything. But when I start translating it and reading it more carefully, no, this is a particular man, Adam, and a particular woman, Eve, and what happened to them at the very beginning of everything. That's what this is an account of.
Can you talk about right now what you saw in the translation that led you in that direction?
No.
Okay. Well, I look forward to it.
No, I mean, I'm not sure I can dredge it up. It's the whole thing. It's the way it hangs together, taken that way, as opposed to trying to take it as a myth. I will point out things along the way that I think are significant in that regard, but I'm not sure I could catalog all my reasons, because they are numerous and
I'll probably make more sense as a question after we've looked at it.
Okay, yeah.
I was going to ask quickly, and you kind of touched on it, but I feel like I'm missing something. What is the significance of the spring that came forth of the ground? You mentioned the rivers, and so outside of the rivers, everything's desolate. But why do you think this spring is mentioned?
It's the source of water to the rivers because there's no rain. God has not sent rain on the land.
So it is the spring that caused the rivers, which then caused
Right.
the
So
vegetation.
evidently the waters are coming from an underground water source rather than the water cycle, the typical water cycle.
Okay, and I guess that seems like I don't know why that would be added. Do you have a theory why?
Well, to begin with, I think he's explaining, how do you have a garden? Where's the water coming from? If there's no rain and the rest of the land is desert, where are you getting water to have a garden? Well, you see there's the spring and it's feeding these rivers, and along the rivers you have the possibility of vegetation. Behind you.
A quick follow-up question on the your point about the tree. So I took you to be saying that there is just a single tree, and it's basically its title in opposition with its description. Maybe you're going to get to this at some point, but at the end, before they're banished from the garden, and God says in your translation, and now might he perhaps reach out his hand and take even from the tree of life? And if there's just the one tree and they've already eaten from it, then I would think that they would have already eaten from the tree of life, and there would no longer be any sort of forbidden fruit from which God would be worried that they'd eat.
Well, it was forbidden before they ate from it. It was forbidden when they ate from it. And what we learn is he's forbidding them to continue eating from it. That's what that last account is. Another thing, an adjustment. I grew up thinking that we are to understand this tree to have some kind of magical powers. That if you eat from the fruit of this tree, the juice of that tree will impart life to you somehow. That's the way I had always read it. But I think we're going to see that especially the temptation makes a whole lot more sense when we realize the tree of life, the only difference between the tree of life and the tree right next to it is this has a title, the tree of life, and they ain't supposed to eat from it. This tree, identical fruit, but they can eat from that. It's just this is not a magical tree. It's a plain old ordinary tree, just like all the other trees in the garden. It's critical to see that, because if it's a magical tree, then we're talking about fable and myth. We're not talking about history. But there's no reason in the account that we should read it that way. We're just so accustomed to reading it that way that we immediately go there without even thinking about it. But that's the wrong way to take it, I think.
Is it too early to ask about the force of even? Take even from the tree of life at this point? And this is 3. This is in section 11 of the translation. I'm sorry, I know I'm skipping ahead, but since it's related to this question about the two trees.
Where is paragraph 11, you said?
Yeah. So then the God Yahweh, then comes the quote, and now might he perhaps reach out his hand and take even from the tree of life? And
well,
I see your point that if he's, so presumably it could be to prevent him from continuing to eat from the tree of life. But
yeah,
this
and even may not be the best way to translate it. That's my problem.
Okay, gotcha.
As the translator, there's probably better ways to take it, to translate it. But I think that's the point: is that it's very important that we not allow him to continue eating from the tree of life. Okay, now why? Traditionally, or at least the way I had always looked at it, is because God doesn't want a sinner to get immortality. So God doesn't want this magic juice to give him immortality when he's a sinner. I mean, that would wreck like everything. So God is sort of panicked here that we make sure that he stays away from it. I don't think that's it. And that's not the right way to look at it. What's the significance of eating from the tree of life? It's simply symbolic. From the very get-go, it was symbolic. The tree that he was forbidden from eating of, the tree of life, it's symbolic that he is forbidden from eating from it. It's not that if he did eat from it, would anything happen in the cosmos that's any different from him eating from the next one? No. From the neighboring tree? No, nothing different would happen. But the symbolism would be that God is going to grant life to this creature. And the problem is, it is not known yet whether God is going to grant life to this creature. That's why he's forbidden from eating from it. Because the symbolic significance of him eating from it would be that God is going to grant life to him. Now, I'm going to argue, what's the life that is granted to him? Life beyond the grave, what we know of in the eternal, in the New Testament as eternal life. You know, none of us believe that we come to Jesus and we become instantaneously immortal. We all believe that we will die, but that our hope is the grave will not keep us. We will be raised again and transformed into immortal beings on the other side of the grave. That was what was at issue in the garden from the get-go. You're going to die. I created you mortal beings. You're going to die. The question is, will you be given life beyond the grave? Or will you die the death? Will you die the death that keeps you in the grave? Or will you be granted life beyond the grave? To eat from the tree of life is a symbolic representation that God is committed to raising them from the dead and giving them life beyond the grave. So after they have demonstrated that they are unworthy, depraved creatures, God is saying, well, we mustn't let them eat from the tree of life then, because it's just not true that I'm committed to giving them life beyond the grave. Their destiny, as they themselves have made clear through their actions, is that they are unworthy of that and that they are going to die the death. All right, shall we go on? So he's been created and put in the garden now, and you're going to ask me why, and I don't know why, but he goes into this geography lesson. Okay. Now a river flowed out of Eden and provided water to the garden. So it was one of these rivers that's allowing this garden to grow. From there it separated and became 4 headwaters. The name of the first was Fison. It encircled the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. And bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It encircled the whole land of Cush. Now the name of the third river is Tigris. That one flows on the east of Assyria. The fourth river is Euphrates. Okay, now I don't know why that's included here, but given that it's included here, it's grounding what's happening here in actual geography and actual history. Now, if we try to reconstruct this from modern maps, it ain't going to happen. But my understanding is it's quite common for the names of ancient geographical features to get transposed onto different geographical features later in history. So what rivers and lands and so on these represented at the time this was written, we have no clue. So the whole meaning of this paragraph is basically lost to us, other than the basic idea that we have a river coming into headwaters that is the source of the water to the garden. That's the only thing we really know for sure.
So first off, are you saying then that it's metaphorical, that this land is like that?
No, I'm not saying it's metaphorical. I'm saying, there's all kinds of possibilities. There have been cataclysmic events in the world that have changed the whole topography of the world. Some people argue that Noah's flood was one big such cataclysm that completely transformed the topography of the world. That being the case, this doesn't even exist any longer. I mean, this topography doesn't exist any longer. So those names post cataclysm got shifted and adjusted and attached to other rivers, other lands, and so on. And so if we tried to look backwards and reconstructed this paragraph based on later knowledge of geography, we're going to get a false picture.
Okay, I'm hoping this is a good question. Do you know when this was written?
I do not. I hope that's a good answer.
Because the meaning of these locations would depend on who wrote them down.
Absolutely. I'm assuming this is ancient and original. So I'm assuming it predates Noah. Okay, let's go on. Now the God Yahweh took the human being whom he had fashioned and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and maintain it. So interestingly, the role he's given is to cultivate the garden that God placed him in. The God Yahweh instructed Adam, the human, saying, "From every tree which is in the garden you shall eat what is there to eat. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it, because in the day that you eat from it, you shall be condemned to die the death." Now, what most translators do is they take a Hebrew word there as a participle that I'm suggesting is a noun. And that's why I've said and you wouldn't know from the consonants, you wouldn't know whether it's a participle or a noun. It could be either. So it's just a judgment call about which way to take it. I'm taking it, the Septuagint translates it as a noun. So I'm following the Septuagint here. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scripture. You shall be condemned to die the death. Obviously, that only makes sense if we know what the death is, right? To be condemned to die the death. And what I'm stipulating is the death is the death the whole cotton-picking Bible is concerned with, is preoccupied with. The death, what Revelation calls the second death. It's the death of deaths. It's the death where you not only go to the grave, but you do not see existence beyond the grave. That's the death. Okay? So that's the condemnation that God says awaits you if you eat in disobedience to me, if you eat from the tree. Now, why? Because they ate from the tree? No. It's because they disobeyed the commandment of their Creator. It's what it represents about who they are and their hearts and their disposition, their orientation toward the Creator. That's what's significant. It's not the act itself. Because like I said, the act itself is trivial. They could have eaten from the tree right next door and it would have been virtually the same thing. There's nothing inherently immoral about eating the fruit of that tree. But God said, don't do it. And the issue is, you going to do it or ain't you? Let's find out what you're made of. Let's find out what your attitude toward me is. And when we get to the temptation, we'll see how subtle Satan's temptation is. I mean, it's delicious. I didn't mean that. Okay, questions on that paragraph?
You've got the words "be condemned to die."
Mm-hmm.
They're small. Was that just a mistake?
It's literally, you shall die the death.
You shall
literally.
die the death. So
yeah.
you're supplying that.
Yeah.
Is what you're doing.
Yeah, the
That's
little. Yeah, exactly. And the reason I add that is because I think it's quite clear that they didn't die the death when they transgressed. So the issue is what exactly was God claiming. And I think what he's saying is you are sealing your fate in the day that you eat of it. You're sealing your fate, the fate being that you will die the death.
So actually, on that same question, I'm wondering about the force in the Hebrew of shall. I mean, what sort of verbal construction is that? Because I've heard a lot of different interpretations saying that God is basically describing what's going to happen to them, not essentially threatening them or laying out, as it were, the unnatural consequences for this act. And for instance, also when he talks about Eve's desire being for her husband and that sort of thing, it's also describing the natural outcome of the events and not any kind of imposed penalty on top.
Well, the way I'm taking it, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether it's just a flat out prediction or a warning about what action he's going to take. The way I'm taking it, it comes to the same thing either way. That is, the issue is, are you or are you not going to stay in the grave ultimately and die the second death or not? As a prediction, it's true. As a flat out simple prediction, it's true. They're not going to survive death. They're going to remain dead. As a warning, threat, or a statement about what God is proactively going to do, why are they going to stay dead? Because God is proactively not going to raise them from the dead. He's not going to grant them mercy. So for me, it comes to the same thing. Now, I think what you're talking about are the people who want to make the death just sort of the natural consequences in sociology, psychology, throughout. I don't take it that way. I think he's not talking about anything that transpires in this world. There are consequences to our sinfulness, and that's part of what he's going to talk about after the fall. There are consequences to our sinfulness, but the real issue about our sinfulness is, are we going to die the death or not? And that's beyond our lives here. Anything else on that paragraph? Okay, let's go on. Now we have a new section, the creation of the prototypical woman, and then some comments on marriage. Then the God Yahweh said, "It is not good for the human being to be alone. I will make a helper that corresponds to him." Now, let me just comment on that first. Okay, first of all, the helper that he's making is going to be an answer to his aloneness. That's clear. That's explicit in the text. It's not good for him to be alone. What am I going to do in response to the problem of his aloneness? I'm going to make a helper that corresponds to him. The word that's translated helper is eitzer. And it's critical that we understand the significant, what is and is not the significance of that word. Because there's a tendency for helper in our idiom to talk about someone less important or subservient or replaceable, hired help. That's easy to come by, right? But that's not the connotation of this at all. The word is probably used as frequently of God as it is of a human being. I haven't counted, but it is quite common to have God described as the eitzer of Israel, the helper of Israel. Well, he's not hired help. He's not the support staff. He doesn't make the beds and clean the toilets. He is the one who addresses whatever obstacle or problem stands in the way of Israel, and he comes to their aid and bails them out and helps them. That's an eitzer. So it's important to get perspective on that. Adam needs an eitzer corresponding to him, and I think the corresponding to him part, or it's probably the Hebrew's a little weird there. It would be like vis-a-vis Adam, as over against Adam. But I think the significance of that is there's Adam, a human being. There's Eve, human being. She ain't no camel or donkey or beast of burden. She's a human being just like he is. That I think that's what's being communicated here. But she's an Eitzer. Now, what's the significance of being an Eitzer? Paul makes a huge big deal of this in both 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians and maybe another one of his letters. He makes a big deal of this. Adam was created first and then Eve. Man was not created for the woman was created for man, Paul says. Well, he's getting it right from here. Adam was created first. He was alone. His aloneness was a problem. God saw that as a problem, and he set out to create an Eitzer corresponding to him, a helper corresponding to him. Why can God be called an Eitzer? Because whatever problem Israel faces is not God's problem, it's Israel's problem. So you're a helper if you are coming to the aid of someone who has a task, a role, a problem, an obstacle, or something that is their problem, their task, their assignment, their obstacle. It belongs to them, but you're coming to help them with their problem. So the woman is described as an Eitzer because the man already exists, has already been given a direct relationship to his creator with certain responsibilities that go with that. The woman is given to him to help him with his responsibilities. Okay, that's what makes her an Eitzer. There's all kinds of things we could say about that, but I'll leave it to your questions. That's as far as we need to go to understand the text here. It is not good for the human being to be alone. I will make an Eitzer that corresponds to him. Now, out of the ground, Yahweh had fashioned every living creature of the wild and every bird of the sky, and he brought them, and notice he had fashioned them. He'd already done that, I believe. And that's my translation, but I think that's what's going on here. And he brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And in every case, whatever Adam called them, the living being, that was its name. Now Adam assigned names to all the tameable animals and to all the birds of the sky and to all the living creatures of the wild. But for Adam, he did not find a helper that corresponded to him. He did not find an Eitzer that corresponded to him. Exactly the same phrase that was used up earlier. I will make a Eitzer that corresponds to him. So none of these animals fit the bill. None of these animals are the Eitzer that corresponds to him. And not only God knows that, but Adam knows that. Adam sees that, having named the animals. And I think the significance of naming them, I haven't given a lot of thought to this, and probably not enough thought to this, but it does seem to be the case that you only classify and name after you have observed and understood. So he's done this scientific research on these animals and has made observations and figured out what their nature is and what exactly these living beings are. And then out of his knowledge and understanding of these living beings, he names them. Well, in the process of naming them, then he understands who these animals are, and there ain't none of them who can be an Eitzer that correspond to him. Now the God Yahweh caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his sides and filled out the flesh where it was now missing. So takes a chunk of flesh out of his side, then uses a little wood filler to fill up the side, and he's got this pound of flesh. Then the God Yahweh formed the side which he had taken from Adam into a woman and brought her to Adam. And Adam said, "This she now is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. and this she shall be called my wife, for this she was taken out of her husband. And it's this she shall be called my Isha, for this she was taken out of her Ish. So the word for husband is Ish, and the word for wife is Isha. Now, okay, so what Adam is saying is this female that you have made, this she that you have made, is literally made from my flesh. God took his flesh and made the woman out of his flesh. She literally is from my flesh, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And it's for this reason that she shall be called my wife. For this she was taken out of her husband. Okay, now, what is he saying? I think what he's saying is, you have taken my very flesh and have created an Eitzer corresponding to me that you are giving to me as a gift. You're giving her to me to be that Eitzer that corresponds to me. That's why she should be called my wife, because she's mine. She is the one given to me. Now, don't think of this as a universal male speaking of a universal female. See, that's I think, if it's a myth, that's what we're talking about. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think Adam is saying this woman should be called my wife because you made her from my flesh for me. That's why she should be called my wife. The counterpart of that, of course, and that's what he comments on. Look what he says in the next parenthetical comment. For this reason, a husband will forsake his father and his mother and will unite inseparably to his wife, and the two shall be as one flesh. Now he's universalizing it. If it was a myth, you wouldn't need to do that, right? It's already universalized. Now he universalizes it. That's why husbands leave their fathers and mothers and unite with their wives, and they become as one flesh. And I, for decades, have misinterpreted what he means by that, I think. It's clear to me now what he's saying. They will be as one flesh. He's just finished saying, this she is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. We share the same flesh. We are one flesh together. That's what he's just said. Well, that's why universally husbands leave fathers and mothers and unite with their wives, and the two shall become one flesh. The way Paul deals with that in Ephesians, you remember what he says in Ephesians when he's talking about marriage? Husbands love their wives as their own bodies. I think he's getting that from here. A husband is to love his wife as he would his own body. That is, she is one flesh with me. At least that's the perspective I'm supposed to take. I think this is basically a commandment, and the two shall be as one flesh. It doesn't automatically happen. It's not a metaphysical reality that sort of pops into place. It's a moral commitment that a man is making in marriage to unite so closely to my wife, to view her as important to me as my very own body. That's the ideal. I should love her. I should make her as dear to me as my own body is dear to me. And that's the marriage commitment as it ought to be. That's the ideal marriage commitment. So whoever is writing this is commenting on the significance of what happened between Adam and Eve and the origin of male and female, and therefore the origin of their marriage. He's commenting on that with regard to what is universally true of marriage between any man and any woman. Now the two were naked, Adam and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now that's going to become significant because after the transgression, they are aware of their nakedness. At this point, they're naked and not even cognizant of their nakedness, but they become cognizant of their nakedness. And I'm going to argue because, I mean, that has a lot to teach us about the nature of human sexuality, I think. God has just so wired the human psyche that, and until we brutalize it and talk ourselves out of it and beat it out of us. But what comes naturally to us is a kind of modesty that to expose especially my genitals, but to expose my sexuality to someone is to expose me. There's an identification between sexuality and my very being, my very self. You can't get more intimate than your sexuality, in other words. You're getting deeply into knowing me if you know me sexually. That's true of them here, but the reason they're not cognizant of being exposed is because they have nothing to be ashamed of at this point. They know no shame. But the minute they know shame, they know they're naked. Now, do you see how that follows? If I have shame, I want to hide. I don't want you to see me, so I don't want you to see me in my nakedness. As long as I have no shame, I don't have any problem with that. But the minute I have shame, then I want to hide. And that's actually as it should be, because we do know shame. We do have something to hide. So that's a very, very reasonable and logical and natural impulse in us, is to want to be hidden. Because I am not a good creature, I am a bad creature, and I know it.
So earlier you were saying that eating of the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, did not do a metaphysical thing to them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a test that revealed the state that they were in.
And it imparted knowledge to them.
So you're saying it did impart knowledge to them.
Yeah, but
So
not the juices of the tree. It was the actual act of disobedience that now gave them a basis for knowing something. I disobeyed my Creator. He told me not to do it, and I did it. Now I know what kind of being I am.
Therefore, I know that I'm not good.
Yeah.
I'm now ashamed. Oh, goodness, I have no clothes on?
Yeah, essentially. Is there a problem with that?
Shall we call him Emperor Adam?
Yeah, just how we go from it not doing a metaphysical thing to imparting knowledge. That thing there, how does that work?
Well, okay, if you want to call experience leading to knowledge metaphysical, okay, then there is a metaphysical change. All I meant to say by that earlier is, it's not like my DNA is so structured that it makes me a morally perfect being. I drink this chemical that comes through the fruit that changes my DNA so that now I'm a morally imperfect being. That's what I mean by metaphysical. Right. Pardon?
Right, I got that.
Okay. So. Yeah, that's what I meant by that.
So it's just that, oh crap, I just did what I wasn't supposed to do. That must mean that I'm bad, therefore now I'm ashamed. Oh gosh, I have no clothes on.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's not like they're learning knowledge about everything.
But let me make it sound not quite so silly.
Okay.
I did this thing I'm not supposed to do. Look at what kind of person I am. Oh crap, I don't want to be seen. I don't want anybody to see me. The nakedness is the exposure, and so the clothing is the hiding of myself.
and they're specifically hiding themselves from God, not from each other. I would imagine, since they're viewing each other as one flesh.
Yeah,
Same.
except that I think the comment in the text about their eyes were opened and they realized that they were naked actually comes before the part where God's coming through the garden and they're hiding from God. I mean, it's both, I think.
Okay.
It's even in the presence of each other, they realize they're naked.
I think psychologically that makes a lot of sense, because if you have a picture of yourself as being a good person or whatever, and then you do something, it's the act of doing it that forces you into the position of realizing, oh, wait, I'm not so good as I thought I was.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I also wanted to ask a question on the naming, if that's okay. Is the purpose of the naming purely as a lesson for Adam, or does it have some other purposes as well?
Well, in this account, that seems to be the role it's playing, is purely as a lesson for Adam that there is no other suitable being that God has created to be this Eitzer corresponding to you. That's certainly the emphasis. I don't, but it is really interesting.
It's a strange kind of thing to do as a lesson. I mean, I could imagine two different kinds of lessons there. One lesson would be, wow, they all have 4 legs and I have 2, so there's no humans.
Right.
Another lesson could be, wow, they all come in pairs. Where's my pair?
Right.
Right. I mean, it seems like those are 2 different ways they could go with it.
Right.
And then a third thing that I don't know. I mean, maybe you talked about this last time, and I've forgotten, but it seemed very significant to me that in the previous account of Genesis, God mentions multiple times that you shall have dominion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if the naming is related in any sense to that.
Could be. Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know whether cultivate is in any way related to dominion either, but I don't know. Naming, in some sense, naming is sort of like, it is giving language. It's saying, I know something about you. I don't know
mm-hmm.
how to make sense of that.
There are all kinds of claims made that I don't find plausible. Like in the ancient world, if you name something, then you had power over it, and that kind of stuff.
Sure.
That doesn't seem to be at work here at all. But I do think that you're on the right track with respect to, because there are a couple of things that are missing from this account. Interestingly, it doesn't say that man is made in the image of God, but it's implied in so many different ways throughout this thing. And it doesn't say you will rule over the animals, but I think you're right. But it's implied in the cultivating and the naming and in various other ways. So it's the same claims are being made, but it's a different account and it goes about it in a different way. But I think you're probably right that there is that connection.
So this is not a fully formed question, but when he realizes that there is Eve there, or a woman that is like him, is that in response to the lesson that he learned? Is it a direct response to the lesson that he learned from looking at the animals? Is it like if the lesson is they all come in pairs, then seeing Eve is like, oh, I have a pair that's completed me because now there's a pair. Or if the lesson is none of them look like me, then seeing her
none of them talked back.
What's that?
None of them talked back.
Then careful, Jack. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's possible, but I'm not inclined to go there directly. I don't think it's quite that simple. What he emphasizes is, God, you put me to sleep and you took a chunk of my flesh and you made a creature out of me. That's what he emphasizes, is that none of those other creatures are made out of me and are corresponding to me in the way.
So that could correspond to the lesson. Oh, look at all of them. They don't look like me. And now all of a sudden I see Eve. She looks like me. That's me. So now my lesson was that there's none like me. Now there's one like me. It's made out of me.
Yeah.
Maybe not. I don't know.
But I think that's right, and it's just that none of that stuff is explicit about. I didn't see a pair. Or, I didn't see anybody with two legs. I mean, none of that
I'm just
is made
trying to figure
explicit.
out what the lesson could be. Right?
Yeah. But I don't think what he's saying here is, I don't think my wife was made out of my flesh. I think only Eve was made out of the flesh of Adam. That's the only time in history where you have a wife literally created out of the flesh of the husband.
Sure.
That's why he goes on to say, okay, your wife wasn't created out of your flesh, Jack, but this is what you're supposed to do, is to enter into a relationship and a commitment where you make her that dear to you as if she were one flesh with you. Just like the original man and woman that God created.
Well, this was a huge section, very exciting. And I was wondering, Jack, trying to find the right sentence here. What do you think is the importance of Adam being originally created as a hermaphrodite?
What do I think about that?
Yeah. I mean, here he was as he wasn't distinctly male before he lost something, right?
Well, I think
he's called Adam, right?
Yeah. I'd have to go back and look at the grammar. Yeah, I don't know.
Well,
there's no reason to think that he's a hermaphrodite.
Well, here's my thought. Here, men and women are metaphysically different. Yeah, we'll agree there. Eve, therefore, is metaphysically different from Adam. Eve was made from a rib that came from Adam, aside from Adam. And therefore, Adam lost something, right?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's not what's emphasized. It's not emphasized that he lost something. God just took a chunk of his side and then he patched it. He filled it back in. So he's left with a chunk of Adam's side that he forms into the woman. But there's no emphasis that he lost something essential when he did that. In fact, it seems like God recreated it back in its place so that he lost nothing.
But it's not emphasized that something important happened or it changed about the building material that God was using. It seems like the emphasis is that this is made from the same thing.
Right.
This is the same thing.
Right.
And there's this is how it's different, or this is how I've made it different in this story.
Well, I think the emphasis is on how it's the same. Male and female, they may be different in their sexuality, but they are identical in their earthy humanity. They are the same.
Are you sure? Because it seems like this is a story about how men are completed by women. That's what it seems like.
How they are completed by women?
It seems like here Adam is, and he's like, whoa, part of me is now not here anymore. Part of me is that. Who is that?
Okay, I see where you're getting that. That's not the way I'm taking it. It's not that I'm lacking, I'm missing something, and she's filling me up, but rather, if you set out to make an Eitzer corresponding to me, she corresponds to me. She's flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. She's the real deal.
So if that's what it means to be of the same flesh, to be of the same species, then how can, I guess, verse 15, how is it important to be one flesh? if in the story of Adam and Eve, they are the same flesh, being the same person, or being both humans. And then in the same way, marriage is you're both humans.
Okay, well, two things. There's two assumptions I'm making that I think are different than yours.
Mhm.
It's critical. That's why it's critical to realize this is a story of Adam and Eve, not universal male and universal female. Not every female in the world is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. I dare not look at other females in the world as belonging to me.
Okay.
That's a problem in our culture. It's a huge problem in our culture. That I dare not do that. The one who is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh is the one that God gave to me to be my wife. And that's why she will be called wife, because she is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It's not about being female. It's about being my wife. See, this is about marriage, not male and female in the world, not the male and female species. That's what I didn't get for so many decades looking at this thing. Adam had a wife that was created specially for him, literally out of his flesh. I don't have a wife literally created out of my flesh, but I do have a wife given to me by God, was a gift to me by my Creator. How that works out is a whole other story, but
We'll allow that.
but it's important for me to view her that way, to recognize she's the one God gave to me. And then the other assumption is, and the two shall be one flesh. I've always thought that meant we'll be united into one, something like that. Yeah. No, I think what he's saying is, and you, Jack, will make her as dear to you as your very own body, your very own flesh. That's the way Paul reads it in Ephesians.
Can you walk me through how Paul could have gotten there? Because that seems like a really huge leap, because Adam isn't very concerned with keeping Eve safe or like keeping her body safe or anything like that. And so now being of the same flesh means that I'm concerned with... Because you're like, okay.
Why do you say that he's not concerned with that?
I don't see it anywhere. Where does it say? And then he was like, let me keep you safe because you're my body.
Remember, Adam's a bad husband. He's not the ideal husband.
Okay.
But like all husbands, he would like to be that husband. Okay. Wow, this she now is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and this she shall be called my wife, for this she was taken out of me, the husband. Now, what I had never seen before is that when he says the two shall be as one flesh, it's in the context that he has just said, she's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And what does that mean? She's like my own body.
But we've already established that that's what's important about being bone of my bone and flesh of my own flesh is that we're of the same species, that we correspond to each other. That's what I thought we had agreed on that.
No, I mean more than that.
Okay.
Because every female is of the same species as me,
but
I dare not say of other females, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Only my wife can I say that of.
Because?
They're the one given to me. I mean, only Adam can literally say that. But what's the significance of that for me? That's the one, she and only she should be the one that I grant that I attach myself to emotionally and psychologically in such a way that her well-being is as important to me as my own body's well-being. That's the one I must treat in that way. She's God's gift to me. She's that special, particular individual that God gave to me.
Let me try to say that back to you.
Okay.
Adam says, oh, look, this is Eve. She came out of my body and was a gift. And in the same way, husbands look at their wives and say, she was also a gift.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what it means to be of one flesh.
As if she were out of the same body, out of my same body, as if.
I'll come back with questions later. I don't want
Okay.
to.
Okay.
I'm a mic hog. I'm sorry, guys.
Okay.
I'm going to be a mic hog too, if that's okay.
Pardon me?
Can I be a mic hog as well?
Be a what? I
Ask a
missed that.
question.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Sure.
So he's going through the animals, and he doesn't find a helper suitable for him. My reading of that is that the implication is that there were suitable pairs for the animals. Is that an implication that comes from that?
Well, that's not the way
the question
not the way
is,
I'm
what is
taking it.
helper, and how do you get what helper is? In other words, Israel's helper. How is it that? What is Eve helping Adam to do, and where are you getting? Because it seems like what the problem is that he's looked at all these animals, and he needs some help, and they're not providing it for him. So
Right.
What is the kind of help that he's looking at them and seeing they're not providing it for him? I don't see how he could look at them and say, you guys are not providing emotional and psychological help. I think he could look at them and say, you guys all have, spouses or pairs or whatever. I don't got that.
Where did you get the word suitable? Is that
Okay, so that's this translation.
Yeah. Okay. Because I'd have to go back and look at the Hebrew, but I believe the Hebrew is identical to
corresponding to.
Yeah,
okay.
A helper that corresponds to him. So he did not find a helper that corresponds to him. I think the Hebrew is identical, as I recall.
Sure.
So the question is, what does that mean? What does Adam lack? He lacks a partner and a companion to join together with him as a team to take on whatever it is that he has been tasked with by his creator. So he needs someone to partner with him and be a companion to him. None of the other animals can do that because they're not his equal. They're not human. They can't reason with him. They can't talk. They're not persons. He needs a fellow person to be able to join with him and take on life together as a team. I think that's what being the helper means. But the reason she's the helper is because whatever he's being tasked with is his task before his creator, not her task. She will help him in his task. That's where Paul gets the concept of headship in the New Testament. The husband is the head, and the woman is the Eitzer in relationship to that.
So why does he need to look at the animals to figure that out? I mean, he could have figured that out without looking at a single animal. He could have said, God gave me a task. He said,
a woman or a Carpathian monkey.
No, it's more like God gave me a task to do X. All right.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what it is that God has given me the task to dominate the world, cultivate the land, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't need to look at the animals to recognize that he doesn't have a helper. To do that, he can just say, oh, look at that. I'm by myself. I don't have a helper.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go look at all these animals, and somehow I'm going to learn something from looking at all the animals that I didn't realize before. And it seems like it's got to be something about looking at the animals that tells him that he needs help. He doesn't have a helper that he wouldn't have been able to figure out without looking at the animals.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, you'd think that he could figure that out without it. But notice he's not just looking at the animals, he's naming them.
Sure.
So there's something about the naming of them that is somehow critical to his discovering what he needs to discover. And I have to say, I don't know what that is. Yeah.
So was Adam tasked to obey God in everything that God tells Adam to do?
Yes, he was tasked
Yeah.
with cultivating the garden in this case.
So does Eve bear the same task that she has to obey God in everything?
Sure.
And I feel like maybe
Oh, okay. But if I can anticipate where you're going, yeah, every human being has to obey God, but that's not their unique task. I think every man has a unique task. It's the trajectory of their life. What is your life about? What is your goal? What is your project? What is your mission? What is your ministry? What is your whatever? Every man is going to have that. Now, this is not going to sit with modern feminism very well at all. But this is quite clearly Paul's perspective. What we see here is that Adam has an unmediated responsibility to discharge a particular unique task given to him by his creator. Eve has a mediated task. And what is it mediated by? Adam.
what does mediated mean?
It's not that God is coming to Eve and saying, okay, Eve, now here's what I want you to do. Here's your task in life. Here's what I want you to do.
A specific purpose?
Pardon me?
A specific purpose?
Yeah, some kind of specific individual purpose for that individual person. She's going to find what her purpose is in relationship to her husband and what his purpose is. She's helping him.
They kind of like hold each other accountable for, obeying God.
Well, that's part of the corresponding to him. They are equal before God as creatures, and that's always going to be true, that they have an accountability before God to obey God, and they need to hold one another accountable to that. That's absolutely true. But what's unique to Adam is beyond just being a good human being, the way human beings are supposed to be, he has his own particular vocation, if you want to call it that. Well, what's the woman's vocation? Well, it's going to be defined relative to what his vocation is, because she needs to help him.
What does vocation mean?
Well, it means calling, but that doesn't help. Okay, let me. When I found my way into my life project, I discovered that what I need to do is study the Bible, understand it, and share it with the people that I get the opportunity to share it with. That's what I do. That has defined what my wife's calling is, because she helps me accomplish that role and that task. Now, she's going to do that in a way that is defined by what God has created her to be. What if she's a better teacher than I am? What if she's a better communicator than I am? Then how would she help me? She'd write all kinds of books and publish all kinds of books along as I come to understand the Bible and share that with her. She would communicate that to the world, and she would get rich and famous and get all kinds of honor and glory, and I would sit back in the background and study my Bible. Would that be okay and consistent? Absolutely. But she's helping me accomplish the purpose that I, before God, consider God to have given me. I need to fulfill that purpose that God has put me into the world and into history to accomplish.
Yeah.
So it's not, being a helper doesn't necessarily mean being overshadowed by the husband or playing second fiddle to the husband.
I'm not implying that at all.
Okay.
I just really like how God sets a clear way of how a relationship between a man and a woman should be, that if they were to be together, that would be their purpose, to join together as one flesh.
Yeah.
And that's also, I feel like another implication in that is to they're joining together to become one, to become more close to God, and to hold each other accountable for obeying God. Because when somebody fails, they're going to need some help.
Yeah. That's going to be part of the vocation of every human being, without exception, is to honor God, to know, love, and serve God is part of the vocation of everybody, and husband and wife need to hold one accountable to pursue exactly
That's the kind
that.
of husband I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a history, and I think I'm having a genre problem because you're using it to make sense of, well, you're using these two people, they had a relationship, and somehow out of that relationship that they had, you're drawing universal truths. And I'm curious, how do you do that out of history?
Because this is the history of the prototype. I'm arguing that this is the prototypical male and the prototypical female and the prototypical marriage, and they have the prototypical marriage. So from the prototype, you can you can infer all kinds of things about all individual marriages and all individual males and all individual females. And I think we have a precedent for doing that in 4:15. That's an editorial comment where that's exactly what the author is doing, is drawing from the prototype implications for universal man and universal woman. We're running out of time. Let me just give you a prelude to what's going to happen in the next section, just because it'll help cement what we've been talking about here. When we get to the temptation of Eve, then look at what the temptation is. Satan comes along, and I'm going to argue it is Satan. It's not a snake. He probably looks like a human being. He doesn't look like a snake. He looks like a human being. So you've got this Satan in some kind of human form, probably, coming to Eve and saying, has God restricted you? Has he said that there's some tree in the garden that you can't eat from? Yeah, we can eat from all the trees of the garden except the tree in the middle of the garden. Notice it's the tree in the middle of the garden, which was first identified back in the last account as the tree of life. But the tree in the middle of the garden, we can't eat from that. And neither should we touch it lest we die. And Satan says, no, you won't die. God knows that in the day you eat of it, you will have become you will know like he knows. You will know good and evil like he knows. Okay, I've always read that. It's always been encouraged to read that. In the day you eat from that tree, and we didn't make it the tree of life, we made it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there's juices in that trees that supercharge your brain, and you become a moral genius, and you know the difference between good and evil like that. Like that would be a bad thing? I mean, why would that be a bad thing? That doesn't make any sense. But that's not what Satan is saying. Satan is saying, in the day that you decide to eat from that tree, your act of choosing to eat from that tree means that you will have come to know good and evil the way God knows good and evil. And don't you know that that's the day God is waiting for? That won't make God mad. That'll make God incredibly delighted. You're just a child now. You're a child, and God has to tell you what to do and what not to do. Do this, you can't do that. He wants you to know what to do and what not to do the same way he does from your own standpoint. He wants you to think for yourself. He wants you to decide out of your own knowledge and your own experience and your own perspective. That's how he knows what he knows. He wants you to know it that way. That'll be maturity. You will have grown up. You will have become the creature he wants, wise like he wants you to be wise. He won't condemn you to death. He'll be tickled to death. He won't condemn you to death. He'll be tickled pink on the day that you do that. And all of a sudden, Eve has an entirely different perspective on how to look at this. She looks at the tree from her own standpoint. She's been eating from that tree. It's the same cotton picking fruit. She knows it's good to eat, a delight to the eyes. She knows it will be nutritious and delicious. She knows that. And she understands now why it is good to make one wise. That is, she understands how, oh, I see, he's testing me. He's just testing me to see whether I will try my wings and take off on my own and make that decision for myself. So, yes, I will delight him by eating from this fruit. Incredible deception. An incredible trick to make what's evil look good, appear to be good to her. So she takes it and eats it and then gives it to Adam, and we'll have to talk about Adam next week because that's a whole nother story, I think. So that's why it's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. No, we'll have to talk about that next week. So, but I think it's the tree of life is the tree that she's not to eat from. Yeah. It's right here. It's right here.
So I understand we're out of time. Is this on? So the pivotal question to me in this whole text at this point is, it's an account of the revelation of our rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be truly innocent and non-rebellious and be deceived so as to do the wrong thing?
Well, no, I don't think so. Now, what we're going to find is...
Sorry, could you know what? I didn't understand what you were saying no to.
No, you cannot be innocent and be deceived. Deception hooks into my innate propensity toward evil and disobedience and wickedness. It hooks into that.
But surely can one be ignorant and be deceived?
Yeah, and that is the case with Eve. And Eve, what's interesting is as this account goes on, Eve gets better treatment than Adam does.
Right. So a tangent. So Jesus was not deceived because he was not sinful.
Yeah.
So I know you're probably going to talk about this next time, but I can't wait. So jumping the gun. I don't exactly know what my question is, but in the fact that Satan deceives her, he's lying to her. He's the father of lies. He takes something that is good or maybe is clear from God, clear instruction, twists it, supposedly gives her a whole new perspective on it. Anyway, probably what you're going to argue is even though he lies to her and she's maybe innocent, not in the sense of morally, but inexperienced in deception, hasn't got a clue. Mm-hmm. Are you arguing that regardless of her ignorance. She was deceived from her own sinfulness.
There was a hubris and arrogance there that the lie appealed to.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, from my own standpoint, yeah, I would like to do that. I would like to decide how I will live my life from my own standpoint, like God does. There's an arrogance behind that resonated with her, but it shouldn't have. Instead, if she were truly good, then her response would have been, yeah, that's all clever and fine and good, but he told me not to.
Right. What's really interesting about you added a twist that I wasn't expecting, because I've always seen the passages, Satan basically saying, "Is God good?" And Eve could reason, well, if he wasn't, why would he make every tree in the garden available to me and only say no to one? But you're not really emphasizing
I wasn't
that.
emphasizing that. I think that's implicit, though. I do think that's in there. Yeah.
But for you to really take it and give Eve a whole new perspective is so deceptive. I really got to think about that. But it's very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll let you go. We'll finish the temptation and the aftermath and Cain and Abel and on and beyond next time.